Let me ask you a question. How many presidents has Peru had in the last decade? The typical guess would be 3 presidents. 4 or 5 would not be so strange. But no, in the past 10 years, the modern heart of the Inca Empire has gone through no fewer than 7 presidents. And that's not even the worst part. In the past 3 decades, 5 of Peru's presidents have ended up behind bars. The most recent case, Pedro Castillo, who you probably remember for staging what was arguably the most ridiculous self-coup in modern history. So yes, in Peru, corruption and political chaos are the order of the day. Ordinary Peruvians live with constant uncertainty. But there's one thing they know for sure. No matter what happens, whether Trump starts a trade war or the president tries to overthrow himself, the Peruvian currency, the sol, just keep shining. Visualeconomik community, Peru is a true outlier in Latin America. Unfortunately, when we talk about Latin America, we often end up talking about hyperinflation and economic stagnation. But Peru is a major exception. Between 2005 and 2014, Peru's inflation rate hovered around 3%, perfectly in line with the European countries. That kind of stability helped the country grow its GDP by over 6%, way ahead of most of its neighbors. In other words, in recent years, Peru has had one of the most stable currencies in Latin America and one of the fastest growing economies in the entire region. Coincidence? I don't think so. So, what's the secret to Peru's success? Well, according to many, it's a monetary system that only a handful of countries around the world actually use, managed floating exchange rates, also known as a dirty float. And trust me, there's a lot to unpack here. In a recent video, we talked about the massive investments both China and the US are pouring into the country, and we highlighted 2 key reasons behind Peru's boom: its strategic geographic location, and most importantly, the stability of its currency, which reassures investors that their profits won't vanish overnight in a wave of hyperinflation. And if you're still not convinced about how effective Peru's monetary system really is, you don't have to take our word for it. Just ask Bolivia.
Not only Bolivia, the Peruvian sol is now also used as an exchange currency in Brazil. Credit Corp Capital had pointed out that the Peruvian sol could be cataloged as the new Swiss sol due to its impressive performance and strength against other currencies in the region.
That's right, Bolivia is going through a serious crisis, and in the middle of all this chaos, the Peruvian sol has become something like the Argentine peso's version of the US dollar. You see, there are barely any dollars circulating in Bolivia. So when their own currency starts collapsing, people have to look for alternatives, and they turn to the currencies of their neighbors. But here's the thing, last year, the Brazilian real lost 20.4% of its value against the US dollar, and the Mexican peso dropped over 18%. The Peruvian sol, it barely moved, down just 0.97%. Now do you get why people call it the Swiss sol? Demand for the sol is so high outside of Peru that in Bolivia, some currency exchanges were selling it at 3 times the official exchange rate and still couldn't keep up with demand. In other words, Bolivians are willing to pay a premium for money that doesn't lose its value, and Peru happens to offer exactly that. So at this point, you're probably asking these same questions as everyone else. What is Peru doing to make the sol such a strong currency? And since when has its system been a model to follow? Well, in this video, we're going to tell you all about it. Peru hasn't always had such an enviable currency. In fact, just a few decades ago, the Andean country experienced one of the worst hyperinflation crises in Latin America. In 1990, inflation hit, brace yourselves, a staggering 7,600% annually. That was enough to shrink the economy by 25% in just a single quarter, wiping out 15 years of economic growth almost overnight. And it makes sense too. Just so you get an idea, 7,600% inflation means that prices double in less than 2 months, while wages always take much longer to catch up to the cost of your weekly groceries. This disaster also showed up in the exchange rate with the US dollar, which collapsed by more than 50% in just a few years. However, as you can see in this chart, the exchange rate stabilized in the 1990s, and it's been rock solid ever since. It probably won't surprise you to hear that in 1991, Peru introduced the first nuevos soles, which, after all these years, are now simply called sols. The exchange rate, by the way, was set at 1 new sol for every 1 million intis, the former currency. What did Peru do to make its currency go from being in free fall to being the most stable in the region? Well, the answer lies in the most controversial figure in the country's recent history, Alberto Fujimori. Fujimori navigated the public's frustration during Peru's devastating crisis, and that's how he went from being a complete unknown to becoming the country's president in 1990, a position he would renew a few years later through a self-coup, but that's a story for another day. What matters here is that this president pushed through a brutal economic adjustment that moved Peru closer to a free market, business-oriented economy. Among other things, the famous Fuji shock included a 3,000% hike in fuel prices and a 1,000% increase in the cost of water and electricity. He also raised taxes like VAT to balance the budget and sharply limited Congress's ability to ramp up public spending. But what really matters most to us in this video is that Fujimori liberalized trade and the financial system. After his reforms, banks were allowed to reduce their mandatory reserve ratios from 80% to just 15%, giving them a lot more room to operate. He also scrapped interest rates, letting the market decide them freely. But his most significant reform was enshrining the independence of the central bank in the new constitution.
Part of the explanation of the stability of the money lies in a political constitution that includes elements that facilitate such macroeconomic soundness, such as the independence of the Central Reserve Bank and its prohibition to lend directly to the government, equal conditions for domestic and foreign investment, freedom to own other currencies, prohibition to effect contracts through laws and other articles included in the economic title of the 1993 Constitution.
Fujimori also got rid of a 1987 law that nationalized the banking sector, although to be fair, that law was never fully implemented. He also eliminated artificially low interest loans that basically kept the entire agricultural sector afloat. These loans were also a major contributor to the country's quasi-fiscal deficit. Fujimori had a clear diagnosis. Peru's problem was exactly the same one we've talked about over and over when covering Peronist Argentina. Governments spending money they don't have and then asking the central bank to print more to cover the gap, even if that ends up making the currency as worthless as monopoly money. In other words, the first key to the strength of the Peruvian soul has nothing to do with its monetary system, it's about fiscal discipline. Take 2022 for example. Peru's deficit was 3.6% of GDP. Not a great number, sure, but still way better than Colombia's 6% or Brazil's 8%. Of course, many factors are at play here. For one, copper prices, Peru's main export, have skyrocketed, while Brent crude prices have dropped, which has helped keep the country's finances stable. But even beyond that, Peru has historically run smaller deficits than its neighbors. This isn't just a one-year thing. That said, let's get back to Alberto Fujimori's reforms, because, as you're about to see, things weren't as smooth as they might seem. Take a look at this chart. What you're seeing on screen is how many months it took for Peru, Ecuador, and Argentina to return to normal inflation levels after a major shock. And two things really stand out. First, Peru's hyperinflation was absolutely outrageous, the second worst in all of Latin America, behind only Venezuela. And second, despite Fujimori's famous Fuji shock, Peru's recovery was painfully slow. While Argentina managed to bring inflation down to 2% a month within just 4 months, and keep it there for at least a full quarter, Peru took 37 months. That's 9 times longer. The reason? Well, basically, there are 3 main reasons. Number 1. First, Fujimori's president was full of question marks. Pretty much everyone thought that public pressure and the backlash against such a tough adjustment would end up killing the reforms. And no, the self-coup didn't solve the uncertainty, it actually made things worse. Second, inflation wasn't the only issue. Every dollar that came into the central bank had too many potential uses. Fighting inflation, stabilizing the exchange rate, paying off debt, boosting the real economy. In other words, the government didn't put stopping inflation above everything else. And third, there wasn't just one stabilization plan, there were actually 2 completely different ones. During the first 2 years of his presidency, Fujimori used the central bank to adjust the amount of money in the economy by buying and selling US dollars. At the same time, he imposed price controls, not to artificially bring inflation down, but to set higher prices, almost like a kind of tax.
Monetary policy was indirectly responsible for controlling inflation by fixing decreasing rates of growth of the amount of money in circulation. Fiscal policy, for its part, generated a primary surplus designed to cover payments on the external debt by raising the real prices of fuels for the public.
The problem with this system is that the situation was so chaotic that the Central Bank of Peru could not accurately calculate how much to change the money supply. Keep in mind that one of the key parameters is the velocity of money, how fast it passes from hand to hand, and this cannot be measured directly. You have to use estimates deficits, and the central bank simply did not have the means. For this reason, in 1993, its policy took a U-turn. Well, maybe it wasn't such a radical 180-degree turn, so I don't know, let's call it 140 degrees. Fujimori sped up the pace of the bank privatizations and basically let the market take the lead in determining most macroeconomic indicators. In this second phase, the central bank played a much less active role. It no longer had to fine-tune how much money to inject or withdraw from the economy. It simply responded to market demands. And this second reform worked much better, even if it came a bit late and the recovery was still somewhat slow. Still, exchange rate volatility with respect to the money in circulation was 2.34 during the first stage of Fujimori's presidency, but dropped to just 0.21 in the second phase. That's 10 times lower. Another way to see the success of the second stage is that loans in foreign currency, basically dollars, grew from less than 65% to almost 80% between 1990 and 1993. But with the entry into force of the new economic policy, Peruvians' confidence in their currency increased, so that loans in dollars stopped growing and even fell for some years. In short, Fujimori's reforms focused on giving the central bank independence, so it wouldn't be used to finance congressional deficits, and letting market forces guide its decisions. In other words, Peru's success came from doing exactly what other successful countries have done. On top of that, in 2002, the central bank shifted its strategy. Instead of trying to control things like the money supply, it started focusing directly on keeping inflation in check. Now, in theory, both approaches could deliver similar results, but it's way harder to mess up when you're targeting inflation. That's why all serious central banks, like the US Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, use this approach. Initially, the inflation target was set at 2.5% per year, with a 1% margin of error either way. In 2007, it was lowered to 2%. Although, as you can see, none of these changes were very radical in practice. By 2002, when Peru's central bank switched its methodology, inflation was already fully under control. But wait a minute, at the beginning of this video, we told you that the secret behind the Peruvian soul is something called a dirty float. But up until now, we've only talked about things that are pretty standard in developed countries, like having an independent central bank. Now, this wasn't a coincidence. When people talk about Peru's currency, they always highlight the dirty float because it's the most unique aspect of the country's monetary system. But here's one thing you need to understand. Without all those boring things like keeping the deficit under control or making sure politicians can't meddle with the central bank's balance sheet, not even the dirty float would save Peru from falling into inflation. And now that we've made that clear, you're probably all wondering the same thing. What exactly is a dirty float? Well, let's take a look. Broadly speaking, central banks use two main strategies to defend the value of their currency. The first is a fixed exchange rate. The name says it all. It means your currency is pegged to another, usually the US dollar. Now be careful, this is not the same as full dollarization. Saying you'll maintain a 1-to-1 exchange rate with the dollar is very different from actually having the resources to do so. In a dollarized economy, obviously, $1 will always be worth $1. The second strategy is a floating exchange rate, so called because the value of the currency floats on the market day by day. Central banks don't commit to defending a specific exchange rate, though that doesn't mean they ignore the importance of keeping a healthy balance sheet so that markets trust them. Well, Peru, and not just Peru, but also Singapore, India, Turkey, and Indonesia, use a mix of both systems, what's known as a dirty float. And now you can also add Javier Milei's Argentina to that list.
What is the floating between bands announced by Luis Caputo? The Minister of Economy announced that the Central Bank of Argentina will operate a floating exchange rate regime within bands.
The idea is pretty simple. Basically, central banks let the currency float within certain bands, but they step in if it gets too strong or too weak. The goal is to let the market set the value of the currency, but with a safety net in place to avoid chaos during a crisis. And we're not talking about a small safety net here. Peru holds more than $75 billion in foreign currency reserves to defend the soul if needed. Is that a lot? Well, here's a comparison that says it all. Even including its IMF loan, Argentina has less than $40 billion in gross reserves, and that's before subtracting debts. So Peru has almost twice the reserves, even though its GDP is about 3 times smaller. But the size of the reserves isn't the only difference between Peru's dirty float system and Argentina's. In Argentina, everything runs on down a very strict rule. If the peso moves beyond a set band, whether up or down, the central bank steps in immediately. In Peru, though, there's no official limit. The central bank buys dollars when it thinks they're cheap and sells them when it thinks they're expensive. I know, that might sound like a recipe for arbitrary decisions or even corruption, but there's a solid underlying motive. It protects the sol from speculation. Because there's no automatic trigger, investors who want to launch a speculative attack on the sol have no idea how the central bank will respond. That uncertainty makes those attacks far less profitable. Of course, this only works because Peru's constitution guarantees the independence of the central bank. Without that, politicians would almost certainly use this legal grey area to fund their election campaigns. If you're watching this from Argentina, this might all sound very familiar. In conclusion, Peru has the most stable currency in Latin America, even though its political situation is anything but stable. But the truth is, there's no magic formula behind it. In broad terms, Peru does exactly what any country without serious inflation problems does: keep the fiscal deficit under control and ensure the central bank stays independent. Then yes, there's the whole dirty float approach, which adds an extra layer of security. And now it's your turn. Did you know that Peru had one of the most attractive currencies in Latin America? Of all the factors we've mentioned, which one do you think is the most important for keeping the exchange rate stable? And do you think Peru will be able to maintain the strength of its monetary system over the long term? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss any updates. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Thank you for watching.